The dry desert wind whispered across the barren plains of Colorado Territory. It was 1876. The wind carried the scent of death and a promise of salvation Rebecca Owens had long stopped believing in. Her lips were cracked. Her breath was a fire in her lungs. She stumbled forward, one trembling hand pressed against her chest, the other clutching the tattered remnants of a once fine traveling dress. The consumption had driven her west. She was chasing the healing air, the last desperate hope of a woman who had been given a death sentence. But the journey had only tightened the disease's grip, leaving her stranded when the stagecoach driver refused to carry a woman coughing blood. She paused, swaying like a willow in a storm. Another coughing fit tore through her body, each spasm more violent than the last. It sprayed crimson droplets onto the dusty earth. Her knees buckled. The world spun into a blur of blue sky and golden plains. She was 23 years old. She had perhaps only minutes left. Through her tear-blurred vision, she saw a silhouette emerging from the heat haze. A rider, tall in the saddle, approaching at an unhurried pace. She tried to call out, but her voice was a ghost. The rider drew closer. A broad-shouldered man with sun-bronzed skin under a worn leather hat. His stallion's hooves kicked up dust that danced in the late afternoon light. She coughed again, a final ragged explosion of pain. Blood spattered the ground as her strength finally gave way. The last thing Rebecca saw before the darkness took her was the rider dismounting. She saw the concern etched into features that seemed carved from the very mountains looming in the distance. Daniel Evans had been tracking a wayward steer when he spotted her. At first he thought she was a mirage, a trick of the merciless sun on a weary cowboy's eyes. But the sound of her cough, desperate and real, cut through the shimmering heat. He'd seen consumption before. It had taken his mother when he was 12. He recognized the sound of it, the smell of it. "Ma'am," he called, swinging down from his saddle. When she collapsed, he rushed forward, kneeling beside her crumpled form. Her skin burned with fever. Her pulse was a weak, frantic flutter against his calloused fingers, a wounded bird struggling to stay aloft. He glanced around at the empty landscape stretching in all directions. His ranch was 10 miles north, the nearest town 15 miles south. There was no choice to make. He gently gathered her into his arms. He was surprised by how little she weighed, as if the illness had already consumed her from the inside out. "Don't you worry now," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "I've got you." With practiced ease, he mounted his horse, Thunder, cradling her against his chest. He settled her securely, one strong arm wrapped around her waist, the other holding the reins. Her head lolled against his shoulder, dark curls escaping from a once neat bun. He urged the stallion forward at a gentle trot, careful of his dual burden. He felt her body shake with another coughing fit, even in unconsciousness. He tightened his grip, holding her steady. He was riding toward the Double E Ranch, his family's land for 2 generations. As they crested a hill, the valley that held his home spread out below. A modest ranch house stood sturdy against the wilderness, smoke curling from its chimney. Mrs. Potts, his housekeeper, would be preparing supper. "Almost there," he told his silent companion. Mrs. Potts emerged from the house as they approached, her weathered face registering first surprise, then deep concern. At 62, she had seen more than her share of the disease. "Land's sakes, Mr. Evans, what have you brought home now?" she called, hurrying across the yard. "Found her collapsed on the South Range," Daniel explained, carefully dismounting. "Consumption, I reckon. A bad case." The housekeeper's expression softened. "Bring her inside. I'll ready the guest room." Daniel carried Rebecca through the doorway. The ranch house was modest but comfortable, with sturdy furniture built to last. He laid her down on the clean sheets of the guest bed as if she were made of china. In the lamplight, he got his first clear look at her face. Despite the pallor of illness, she was beautiful, with delicate features and long, dark lashes. "She's burning up," Mrs. Potts said, laying a hand on Rebecca's forehead. "I'll fetch water and clean cloths. You send Jimmy for Dr. Wilson." Daniel nodded, striding outside to find his young ranch hand. "Jimmy, ride to town. Fetch the doctor. Tell him it's urgent." The boy was off in a flash, galloping toward town. When Daniel returned to the guest room, Mrs. Potts had removed Rebecca's dusty outer garments and was bathing her face with cool water. "Poor thing," the housekeeper murmured. "Traveling alone, by the looks of her. She's got quality clothes, though, worn from the journey." Daniel noticed a small gold locket around Rebecca's neck, catching the lamplight. "Any idea who she is?" "None. No papers that I found, though there's a small reticule tied to her belt. Haven't looked through it. Didn't seem right." A fresh bout of coughing seized Rebecca, her body convulsing. Blood stained the pristine pillowcase. Daniel felt a pang of something he didn't recognize. Not just pity, a fierce, sharp protectiveness. "Will she make it till the doctor comes?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Potts's lips thinned. "Hard to say. All we can do is make her comfortable and pray." Daniel was not a praying man, not since his father died in a cattle stampede 5 years ago. But he found himself hoping with an intensity that startled him. This stranger had stumbled into his life, and he couldn't bear the thought of her stumbling back out of it. He sat with her through the long night hours, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Each breath was a victory. As the darkness deepened, he found himself talking to her, his deep voice filling the quiet room. He told her about the ranch, about Thunder, about the coming cattle drive. "Don't you give up now," he murmured as she stirred. "You made it this far. That shows you've got grit." Around midnight, her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of summer sage. "Where?" Her voice was a broken whisper. "Double E Ranch," he answered, leaning forward. "I'm Daniel Evans." "Rebecca Owens," she managed. "Thank you." "No need for thanks, Miss Owens." A ghost of a smile touched her pale lips. "Not anyone. The stagecoach driver. He left me." Her eyes closed again, the effort of speaking too much. "The doctor's coming," he assured her. "You just rest." "My things," she murmured. "Safe," he promised. "Everything's safe here." But even as he said the words, he knew they were a lie. Because as Mrs. Potts had tended to her, she had found something else, something that didn't belong, something hidden deep in the hem of Rebecca's dress. It was a small, tightly folded piece of paper covered in what looked like a coded message. Dr. Wilson arrived before dawn. He was a man honed by the frontier, his skills sharp, his demeanor grim. His examination was thorough, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle. Consumption, sure enough, he confirmed, advanced, but not hopeless. The dry air out here might help if she can get through this fever. He began preparing medications from his bag. "She'll need constant care. This disease can spread. It's risky." "She stays," Daniel said, his voice firm. "She's my responsibility now." The doctor sighed, but he saw the stubborn set of the rancher's shoulders and didn't argue. "I'll leave medicine and instructions. I'll be back in 3 days." After he left, Daniel returned to the guest room. Rebecca was sleeping, the pain smoothed from her features. She looked younger, more vulnerable. "What's her story, do you reckon?" Mrs. Potts asked, arranging the medicine bottles. Daniel shook his head. "Don't know, but I aim to find out." As Rebecca slowly regained her strength over the next few weeks, her personality began to emerge. She was educated, well-spoken, with a dry wit that surfaced between coughing fits. She told him she was a teacher from Boston, heading to a non-existent aunt in San Francisco. A story that felt thin, rehearsed. One evening, as he read to her, She finally told him the truth, or at least a version of it. "My aunt passed away 2 months ago," she said, her fingers twisting in the bedsheet. "The letter is from her lawyer. I was traveling to a destination that no longer exists." The desperation in her voice was real. "Well," he said finally, "seems to me you found a new one, for as long as you need." But the questions still gnawed at him. The coded message Mrs. Potts had found, and something else, something the doctor had noticed. Dr. Wilson had returned for his follow-up visit. After examining Rebecca, he pulled Daniel aside. "She's stronger," the doctor said. "But there's something odd. When I was checking her reflexes, I noticed this." He pointed to a small, almost invisible mark on Rebecca's inner wrist. It was a faint tattoo, a complex symbol of interlocking lines. "What is it?" Daniel asked. "Don't know," the doctor admitted, "but I've seen marks like it before, on prospectors, the kind who work for the big mining syndicates. It's a guild mark, a sign of affiliation. A teacher from Boston, or a woman connected to the ruthless, secretive world of mining syndicates." The two stories didn't fit. The coded message now seemed more sinister. What if it wasn't a message at all? What if it was a ledger? That night, after Rebecca was asleep, Daniel took the piece of paper from its hiding place. He spread it out under the lamplight. It wasn't just random letters and numbers. There was a pattern, a repetition. His time as a tracker during the war had taught him to see patterns where others saw chaos. He spent hours studying it, trying different combinations, different keys. Finally, just before dawn, he broke it. It wasn't a letter. It was a list of names, followed by numbers and locations. And one name appeared over and over again. Kane. Silas Kane. The man who owned the bank, the saloon, and most of the souls in the nearby town of Sanctuary. A man known for his ruthlessness. A man who had built his empire on the ruins of other men's dreams. And the locations. They were all mining claims. Claims that had mysteriously failed, or whose owners had met with unfortunate accidents, only to be bought for pennies on the dollar by a holding company secretly owned by Silas Kane. Rebecca Owens wasn't a teacher. She was a courier, a whistleblower. She was carrying the proof of a criminal conspiracy so vast it could tear the entire territory apart. And now, she was under his roof. His ranch wasn't a sanctuary. It was a target. The coded ledger changed everything. It wasn't just consumption that was killing Rebecca. It was the secret she carried. Daniel now understood the haunted look in her eyes, the way she flinched at unexpected sounds. She wasn't just sick. She was being hunted. He said nothing to her. Not yet. She was too fragile. The knowledge that he knew her secret might shatter the fragile trust they were building. Instead, he began to prepare. He rode into the town of Sanctuary, a place he usually avoided. He needed to see this Silas Kane for himself. Kane's saloon was the dark heart of the town. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey and greed. Kane himself sat at a back table, a mountain of a man with pale, watchful eyes. He was playing cards, his movements slow and deliberate, like a spider in the center of its web. Daniel ordered a whiskey and watched. He saw the way the other men deferred to Kane, the fear and respect in their eyes. He saw the sheriff, a man named Brody, walk in and give Kane a deferential nod before taking a seat at his table. Kane owned the law in this town, too. As Daniel was about to leave, a man stumbled through the swinging doors. He was a prospector, his face flushed with excitement. He held up a small leather pouch. "I found it!" he yelled. "Color in the Little Snake River. There's gold in them hills." A hush fell over the saloon. Every eye was on the prospector. Kane's pale eyes flickered with interest. He gestured for the man to come over. Daniel slipped out, the scene confirming his worst fears. Kane wasn't just a banker. He was a predator, always watching, always waiting for the next opportunity. The ledger in his possession was a death warrant for anyone who stood in Kane's way, and that included the woman recovering in his guest room. Back at the ranch, life settled into a strange, tense routine. Rebecca was getting stronger. She was able to sit on the porch in the afternoons, the warm sun on her face. She even began to teach Jimmy, the young ranch hand, his letters. Daniel would watch them, his heart a tight knot of conflicting emotions. The bond between them was growing, a quiet, powerful thing. But it was a bond built on a foundation of secrets. His and hers. He knew he couldn't protect her forever just by hiding her. Kane's reach was long. His spies were everywhere. Eventually, they would find her. The first sign that they were getting close came a week later. 2 of Daniel's best steers were found dead in the north pasture, poisoned. It was a message, a warning. "We know where you are. We can get to you." That night, he made his decision. He couldn't fight Kane alone. He needed allies. He needed the law, not the local bought and paid for law. He needed something bigger. He rode out before dawn, telling Mrs. Potts he was going to Denver to buy a new bull. It was a lie. He was going to the territorial capital to find a U.S. Marshal, someone who couldn't be bought. He left Hank, his foreman, in charge with strict instructions. No one on or off the ranch without his permission, and Rebecca was not to leave the house. He hated leaving her, but he knew it was the only way. The journey was long and hard. He rode relentlessly, pushing himself and his horse to their limits. The fate of the woman he was beginning to love and the future of his ranch depended on his speed. He arrived in Denver covered in dust and exhaustion. He found the marshal's office in the Federal Building. The man behind the desk was a legend. Marshal Franklin Reed, a man who had single-handedly cleaned up 3 territories. He was old now, his face lined with the memory of 1,000 gunfights, but his eyes were still sharp as a hawk's. Daniel laid out the story. He told Reed about Rebecca, about Silas Kane, about the ledger. He didn't have the original, but he had spent a night painstakingly copying it. Reed read the copy, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he was silent for a long time. "This is a dangerous game you're playing, son," he finally said. "Silas Kane is a powerful man. He's got friends in high places, even here." "I know," Daniel said. "That's why I came to you. You're the only one he can't buy." Reed leaned back in his chair. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to come back to Sanctuary with me. I want you to see the evidence for yourself. I want you to help me bring him down." The old marshal studied him for a long, silent moment. "You're risking a lot for this woman, a woman you barely know." "I know enough," Daniel said simply. Reed finally nodded. "All right, Evans. I'll come. But we do this my way, quietly. No badges, no uniforms until we're ready to spring the trap." He stood up, a new fire in his old eyes. "I've been hearing whispers about Kane for years. It's time someone finally put a leash on that dog." But as Daniel rode out of Denver with Marshal Reed and 2 of his most trusted deputies, a new chilling thought entered his mind. What if Kane wasn't the only one with spies? What if his own trip to Denver had been watched? What if, in trying to bring help to Rebecca, he had just led the wolves right to her door? His desperate race to save her had just become a race against time. The ride back to the Double E was a tense, silent journey. Marshal Reed was a man of few words, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He moved with the quiet, deadly efficiency of a man who had spent his life hunting predators. They arrived at the ranch under the cover of darkness. Daniel felt a surge of relief when he saw the lamp burning in the main house window. She was still safe. He introduced Reed and his deputies to a wary Mrs. Potts and Hank. "They're here to help," was all the explanation he gave. He found Rebecca in her room, reading by the light of a single candle. She looked up, her face breaking into a radiant smile when she saw him. "Daniel, you're back!" The pure, uncomplicated joy in her voice was a punch to his gut. He had brought a war to her doorstep. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice grim. He told her everything, about the ledger, about Silas Kane, about his trip to Denver. He watched her face as he spoke, saw the color drain from her cheeks, saw the old, haunted look return to her eyes. When he was done, she was silent for a long moment. "So you know," she finally whispered. "You know everything." "I know you're in danger," he said, taking her hand. "And I know I'm not going to let him hurt you." "You shouldn't have done this, Daniel," she said, her voice shaking. "You should have just let me go. Now you've put yourself, this whole ranch, in his crosshairs. This stopped being just about you a long time ago," he said fiercely. "Kane's a cancer on this territory. He needs to be cut out." The next day, Marshal Reed began his own quiet investigation. He rode into Sanctuary, dressed as a simple drifter, asking casual questions in the saloon, listening to the whispers. What he learned confirmed their worst fears. Kane was on edge. He knew someone was closing in on him. He had doubled the number of guards at his own ranch and was paying men to watch the roads. "He's getting ready for a fight," Reed reported back that night. "And he knows about you, Rebecca. He doesn't know where you are, but he knows you're alive. And he knows you have the ledger." But there was another twist. Something Daniel had never considered. "There's a new player in town," Reed said, his voice low. "A man from back east, a lawyer. He's been asking about you too, Rebecca, but not in a threatening way. He says he represents your family. He says you've inherited a substantial fortune." Rebecca stared at him, her face a mask of confusion. "That's not possible. My family has nothing. We lost everything." "Well, according to this lawyer, a distant uncle you never knew died and left you a very wealthy woman." It was a classic story, a long-lost heir, a surprise inheritance. But it felt wrong. The timing was too perfect. A cold suspicion began to form in Daniel's mind. What if this wasn't a rescue? What if it was just a different kind of trap? The arrival of the lawyer, a man named Sterling, changed the entire dynamic. He was smooth, well-dressed, and his story was convincing. He had documents, legal papers that seemed to confirm Rebecca's inheritance. He expressed profound sympathy for her illness and her ordeal. "My dear Miss Owens," he said, his voice dripping with compassion, "your family has been worried sick. We must get you back to Boston immediately, where you can receive the best medical care." He was offering her everything she had ever wanted: wealth, security, a return to the life she had lost. But Rebecca hesitated. She looked at Daniel, her eyes full of a new, terrible uncertainty. Daniel saw the trap immediately. If she went with Sterling, she would be leaving the protection of the ranch. She would be traveling through open country, vulnerable, an easy target for Kane or for anyone else. And what about the inheritance? What if it was a lie? A way to lure her out, away from him? "She's not well enough to travel," Daniel said, his voice hard. "She'll stay here until she's fully recovered." Sterling's smile thinned just for a second. "Of course, her health is the primary concern. I will remain in Sanctuary until she is fit for the journey." That night, one of Reed's deputies reported back. Sterling wasn't staying at the hotel. He was staying at Silas Kane's ranch. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. Sterling wasn't a lawyer from Boston. He was working with Kane. The inheritance was a lie. A brilliant, cruel, and very clever lie. It was a trap designed to do what threats and violence couldn't. It was designed to appeal to her hope, to her desire for a normal life. It was a trap for her heart. And Daniel knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was about to lose her. Not to Kane's guns, but to a promise of a life he could never give her. The air in the ranch house was thick with unspoken tension. Sterling had become a regular visitor, his presence a constant, unsettling reminder of the life Rebecca had lost. He came bearing gifts from town, new books, fine chocolates, a silk shawl. Each gift was a subtle poison, a reminder of the world of comfort and refinement she had left behind. Daniel watched, his heart a cold knot of dread. He saw the way Rebecca's eyes would linger on the fine things, the way a wistful sadness would sometimes cross her face. He was a simple rancher. He could offer her safety, loyalty, a life of hard work and simple pleasures. He couldn't compete with the ghost of Boston, a ghost Sterling was expertly resurrecting. "He's a good man, Daniel," she told him one evening, after Sterling had spent an hour telling her stories of the Boston social season. "He just wants to help me reclaim my life." "He's a liar, Rebecca," Daniel shot back, his frustration boiling over. "He's working with Kane." She flinched, stung by his harsh tone. "You don't know that. You're just jealous." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Was he? Was his suspicion just a mask for his own fear of losing her? He didn't know anymore. Marshall Reed was getting impatient. "We need to make a move, Evans. We can't wait for Kane to show his hand. We need to force it." The plan they devised was dangerous. It relied on a single fragile variable, Rebecca's trust. They would leak a rumor that Rebecca, convinced by Sterling, had decided to accept the inheritance and return to Boston, a rumor that she would be traveling with Sterling on the Friday stagecoach. It was the perfect bait. If Kane and Sterling were working together, they would see the stagecoach as the perfect opportunity. A public, seemingly legitimate way to get Rebecca away from the protection of the ranch. Once she was on the open road, she would be vulnerable. "It's too risky," Daniel argued. "You'd be putting her directly in their path." "She's already in their path," Reed countered grimly. "This way, at least we control the time and place of the confrontation." The hardest part was convincing Rebecca. She didn't want to believe that Sterling, the man who represented a lifeline to her past, was a monster. "He's offering me a future, Daniel," she said, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "A real future. A life beyond this ranch, beyond this illness." "What if that future is a lie?" he asked gently. "What if the only real thing is what we have right here?" In the end, she agreed. Not because she fully believed him, but because a small, stubborn part of her still trusted him. The morning the stagecoach was scheduled to leave, the tension was a living thing. Rebecca, dressed in her finest traveling clothes, looked pale but resolute. She hugged a tearful Mrs. Potts goodbye. "Be careful, dearie," the old woman whispered. Sterling arrived, his face a mask of solicitous concern. He helped Rebecca into the waiting stagecoach, his touch lingering on her arm. Daniel watched from the porch, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He saw the flicker of doubt in Rebecca's eyes as she looked back at him, a silent plea. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." The stagecoach pulled away, Sterling riding alongside on his fine horse. It rumbled down the long dirt track and disappeared over the first rise. Marshall Reed and his deputies, who had been hidden in the hills, fell in behind, keeping their distance. Daniel and Hank mounted their own horses and took a different path, a high ridge that would allow them to watch the stagecoach's progress from above. The trap was set. Now all they could do was wait to see if the wolves would walk into it. The stagecoach was a coffin on wheels, rattling its way through the vast, empty landscape. Inside, Rebecca sat with her hands clenched in her lap, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every mile that took her away from the Double E Ranch felt like a step toward her own execution. Sterling rode alongside, the picture of a devoted protector. But Rebecca could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. He was waiting for something. An hour out of town, it happened. 3 riders appeared over a small rise blocking the road. They were rough men, their faces hard, their hands resting on their guns. The stagecoach driver, a man on Kane's payroll, pulled the horses to a halt. Sterling rode forward, his hand raised in a gesture of peace. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm, "there's no need for trouble." The leader of the riders, a man with a jagged scar down his cheek, laughed. "We're not here for trouble, lawyer. We're here for the lady." It was happening, just as Daniel had predicted. But then something went wrong, terribly wrong. Sterling wasn't playing the part of a victim. He was playing the part of a commander. "You're late!" Sterling snapped at the scarred man. "The plan was to meet you at the river crossing." The scarred man shrugged. "We got impatient." Rebecca's blood ran cold. The plan. This was all part of a plan. Sterling wasn't Kane's pawn. He was his partner. The inheritance, the kindness, the concern. It was all a lie. A monstrous, calculated lie. Sterling turned in his saddle and looked at her, his face no longer handsome, but twisted into a cruel, triumphant smirk. "You see, my dear Rebecca," he said, "Silas Kane and my employers back east have a mutual interest in the mineral rights in this territory. The ledger you were so foolishly carrying was a threat to that interest, but a dead woman can't testify. And a dead woman's inheritance? Well, that's a different matter entirely. He was going to kill her and use the forged inheritance papers to claim everything." "Get her out of the coach," Sterling ordered. The scarred man dismounted and pulled open the stagecoach door. But just as he reached for her, a single rifle shot cracked through the air. The man grunted, clutching his shoulder, and staggered back. "Federal marshals!" Reed's voice boomed from the hills. "You're surrounded! Drop your weapons!" Chaos erupted. Sterling's men, caught completely by surprise, started firing wildly. The stagecoach driver whipped the horses into a panic, and the coach bolted, careening wildly down the road. Rebecca was thrown against the side of the coach, her head hitting the wooden frame with a sickening thud. Through the window, she could see Daniel, riding thunder down the hillside like a demon, his face a mask of pure fury, his rifle blazing. The battle was short and brutal. Reed and his deputies were professionals. They moved with a deadly efficiency. Sterling, realizing his plan had collapsed, abandoned his men and spurred his horse into a desperate gallop, fleeing back toward the mountains. Daniel saw him go. He wheeled Thunder around and gave chase. The two men disappeared over a ridge, their private war finally coming to its head. The stagecoach, its driver now dead from a stray bullet, finally crashed into a ditch, throwing Rebecca clear. She lay in the dust, her vision swimming, the world a blur of sound and fury. She saw Marshal Reed and his men rounding up the last of the outlaws, and then she saw him, Daniel. He was riding back, his horse moving at a slow, weary walk. He was alone. He slid from the saddle and knelt beside her, his face streaked with dust and grief. "It's over," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He pulled her into his arms. "He's gone." Sterling was dead. The threat was over. They were safe. But as he held her, a new sound reached them. The sound of more riders. A large party coming fast. It wasn't the law, and it wasn't Kane's men. It was a war party, a full war party of Apache warriors, their faces painted for battle, their lances glinting in the sun. They surrounded the small group, their silence more terrifying than any war cry, and at their head rode a man whose face Rebecca recognized from the stories of the territory, the legendary war chief, Cochise. He looked down at them, his dark eyes taking in the scene. He looked at the dead men, at the captured outlaws. Then he looked at Rebecca, and he spoke a single word, a name. Elena. The world stopped spinning. Marshal Reed lowered his rifle, his face a mask of disbelief. "That's not possible," he breathed, but it was. The resemblance was unmistakable, the shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw. She was the spitting image of a woman who had disappeared 20 years ago, a Spanish woman who had married a prospector, a woman who had been taken in a raid and was presumed dead, a woman who was Cochise's sister. Rebecca stared at the formidable warrior, her mind reeling. This was the final, impossible twist. Her mother, who she barely remembered, the woman she thought was a simple doctor's wife from Boston, was Apache royalty. And that made her a princess, the daughter of a chief, and the last living heir to a legacy of power and resistance that the white world had tried and failed to extinguish. The silence that followed Cochise's pronouncement was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind across the plains. Rebecca stared up at the formidable warrior, the man who was her uncle, her mind struggling to reconcile the world she had known with the one that had just been revealed. Her mother, a Spanish woman named Elena, had not died of a fever in Boston. She had been captured in a raid, fallen in love with a Comanche chief, and borne him a daughter. But the peace had been fragile. Tensions with settlers had exploded into violence. Her mother had been killed, and in the chaos, the infant Rebecca had been found and taken in by a childless army doctor and his wife who had raised her as their own, never telling her the truth of her birth. All of it, the letters, the inheritance, her journey west. It was all a lie, a fabrication to lure her back to the territory where her true inheritance, a vast tract of land rich in silver that was part of a contested treaty, could be claimed through her. Sterling hadn't been working for Kane. He'd been working for the railroad, for the same powerful men who had murdered Daniel's father years ago. They had orchestrated everything, using her as a pawn in a decades-long game of land and power. Cochise dismounted, his movements graceful and deliberate. He walked to Rebecca and knelt before her, a gesture of profound respect that stunned everyone present. "Elena's child," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended language. "You have returned to us." The truth, in all its shocking complexity, finally settled over them. Rebecca was not an orphan, not a victim. She was the heir to two worlds, the bridge between two peoples. Daniel looked at her, at the woman he loved, and saw not a fragile schoolteacher, but a queen. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. But now, they would not be fighting alone. The combined power of the Double E Ranch and the Apache Nation would be a force that no railroad, no corrupt official could defeat. The next year, at a great council held under the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, a new treaty was signed. Not with the government, but between the people of the land. The ranchers and the Apache, led by Daniel and Rebecca, agreed to share the resources of the valley, to respect each other's boundaries, to live in peace. The silver from Rebecca's land was used not to enrich a few powerful men, but to build a new future for everyone. They built a school where both Apache and white children learned side by side. They built a hospital. They built a community founded not on conquest, but on mutual respect. Years later, an old woman with sage-green eyes and hair streaked with silver would sit on the porch of a thriving ranch house, a beautiful little girl with cornflower blue eyes in her lap. "Tell me the story again, Mama," the little girl would say. And Rebecca would smile, her gaze meeting the loving eyes of her husband across the porch. "It all started," she would begin, "on a day when a desperate woman collapsed on the plains and a lonely cowboy decided not to ride on by. Their life hadn't been the one either of them had planned. It had been harder, more dangerous, and more beautiful than they could have ever imagined. The consumption that had threatened to take Rebecca's life had, in the end, been the very thing that led her home. And the lonely rancher who had thought his life was over had discovered that it was just beginning. They had faced down outlaws, corrupt officials, and the ghosts of their own pasts. They had learned that family is not always about blood, but about the people who stand with you when the world tries to tear you down. And they had proven that sometimes the most powerful force on the frontier isn't a gun or a deed or a railroad. It's love. unexpected, unconventional, and strong enough to build a new world from the ashes of the old. If you believe that the most unlikely connections can forge the strongest families, and that true strength is found in choosing to stand together against all odds, then do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss the next chapter in our stories from the heart of the Old West. And let us know in the comments, what do you think is the true meaning of home? Thanks for watching.